Welcome, leaders, to ChurchPulse Weekly. It's Carrie Newhoff, and I'm so excited to be with you again today. We are getting ready to step into the summer, and I want to thank you for your listening. Thank you for sharing this podcast. Thanks for letting us know it's making a difference in your life. And I know a lot of you right now are trying to navigate how to lead the next generation. That's a real challenge. And today we have a couple of incredible young leaders on the show. We've got Grant Skeldon and Luke LeFevre. Grant Skeldon moved to Nashville in 2020 to become the Next Gen Director for Q Ideas with Gabe and Rebecca Lyons. And he is educating and equipping Christians to engage our cultural moment. And Luke LeFevre is a 25-year-old. He lives in Nashville as well. He's the visionary director of young adults. He's got a conference called Consecrate that calls his generation to radical holiness, audacious faith, and a renewed commitment to the Great Commission. Now, this time around, I didn't do the interview. David Kinnaman didn't do the interview, but our good friend Joe Jensen, who is the VP of Church Engagement, sat down to interview Grant and Luke about what they're learning about the next generation. So I'm going to give it over to Joe Jensen and now join in on the conversation with Grant and Luke.
Hey, Grant and Luke, thanks for joining us for ChurchPulse Weekly.
Thanks for having us.
Really excited about today's conversation. Grant, we're going to talk about how to reach and engage Gen Z. And we have this idea, instead of just talking about Gen Z, let's talk with Gen Z, which is what brings Luke to the table today. Luke, thanks for joining us. You're doing some dynamic work as a young Gen Z leader. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But I want to start off with some data. We are launching a brand new project this fall called the Open Generation. It's a global look at today's teens. Really excited about this. There's so much great data in this. We just released a few sneak peek stats a couple weeks ago. Wanted to share a couple of those with you. We found a couple things. First is we found that most teenagers around the world across different faith groups have a very positive perception of Jesus, which I know might surprise some people. There's this global impression of Jesus that he's loving, caring, trustworthy, generous, wise, peaceful, and this glowing list goes on and on. And they not only recognize Jesus as positive, but as someone who is real as well. Almost half say that Jesus was crucified, 47%. And about a third believe that he actually raised from the dead. So we have this this generation that's very open to this Jesus who is historically real and overall pretty positive. We also found that this generation is open to making a real difference in the world. 87% of them agree, at least somewhat, that their generation has the ability to make a positive and meaningful impact in the world. So the Open Generation, we love this title. We think it says a lot about this generation. So how are you seeing this description of the Open Generation play out in your work with Gen Z?
Yeah, I think those stats and just that label of the Open Generation, I love that because I do think that's very descriptive of what's happening right now. Just to give some encouragement to the leaders listening, Gen Z is very hungry for the gospel. And every generation is, right? It's what everybody's looking for, but there is a particular openness. And when they get it and when they lay hold of it, they're really radical about it too. Which is a really key thing that I feel like we're seeing. And so just for example, like here in Nashville, where I live, over the past, I'd say about 3 years now, we've seen over 1,000 high school and college students respond to the gospel in like 2 counties alone. But they're not in the traditional places. It's not, where you would think of. It's in the middle of some of the craziest parties and, that you can imagine. Like imagine some of the craziest like frat parties you've ever heard of, and hundreds of students are getting saved when the gospel gets presented. And just to be clear also on that point, it's not a, hey, do you want to add a little bit of Jesus to your life gospel? I mean, it is a clear call to repent and follow Jesus. And they're like, yeah, I want that. There's a, even Grant mentioning the Joe Rogans and the Gary V's, they're very drawn to the people that like just tell you as it is.
Yeah, that's true.
Like tell it like it is. the influencers that just are like cussing up a storm and are like, you just need to get your life together and you need to, pull yourself up with the bootstraps and make something of your life. They're like, they eat it up. And, we were joking, I think Grant, it was you and me and somebody else a while ago, but we were saying that the messages that would have shut down churches 15 years ago are the ones that are like bringing revival, like to the Gen Z generation that they're eating up, that they're hungry for. And so I would say that those stats and just that label, I love that, the open generation. It is kind of like they're sitting back going, we're not closed off to Jesus. We're just waiting to hear something that's worth following and worth giving our life for. And when they hear it and when they see it, they're pretty radical. They respond pretty radically to it.
Yeah, Grant, you've been studying kind of next gen, so you wrote this book, Passion Generation, talking about millennials. And, you and I have conversations recently just about, there's some similarities between millennials and Gen Z, and then there's some big differences. I'd love for you to start with the differences. What's different about Gen Z from what you've learned over the last few years, and what's the same, and what do you think we should be paying attention to as leaders?
I think, and Luke, I want to set you up kind of to share on this, because they're probably the biggest difference that I'm seeing is, I think Gen Z is realizing, most of the most mature of Gen Z is realizing that you can't do what millennials did in trying to be cool enough to reach the next generation, or you can't be relatable enough or relevant enough. There's probably a line where it's like, oh, this really resonates today in the world, that and Jesus said this, and this really resonates and Jesus said that, like loving people and forgiveness. And there's certain things about Jesus, like you can't be true to yourself and share your truth, but also die to yourself. Those messages really conflict with each other. There's just several messages, even do what's best for you, and there's just even an idea of, like, I actually think one thing that's changed for millennials and kind of changing towards Gen Z is, I feel like there used to be all this talk about the prosperity gospel. Just like 10 years ago, it was like, man, we got to get against the prosperity gospel. These guys that are preaching the prosperity gospel, these are the downsides and what will happen if we buy into the prosperity gospel. I don't see a lot of Gen Z buying into the prosperity gospel. I would say they're kind of buying into maybe this like purpose gospel, kind of like God's sole purpose is to help your purpose. It's a lot of the preaching that resonates with Gen Z does tend to be, just about like, he's going to open a door. He's going to make a way. He's going to, and it's like your calling. It's about your gifting. It's about what you're going to go do, what you're going to start. We're seeing a lot of young people. I mean, the rise of young people. I remember seeing, I think it was Business Journal said that 52% of young people would actually take a pay cut at their job in order to have a job that made a difference. If they could, like, they don't care about getting paid as much as they care about making a difference. And so I think where the narratives kind of shift is, well, if we can't motivate them by money, let's motivate them by purpose. And I see that bleed into the church a lot today. And what that can do is, you're not preparing a generation for suffering. You're not preparing a generation for the real and difficult times that will come, versus like Jesus saying, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I overcome the world. It's not if you have trouble, it's like you will have trouble. I'm seeing a lot of tension there, but I think the biggest contrast that I appreciate, especially about Luke, if you want to share anything on this, is, while my generation maybe swung the pendulum a little too far in trying to be cool enough to reach the next generation. We love Kanye West when he's a Christian and doing Christian things. We love Justin Bieber when he's a Christian and doing Christian things. We love when any celebrity, like when Shawn Mendes talked about how he listened to Maverick City and had an encounter with God, like those things get shared. When Dua Lipa was with Stephen Colbert recently and talked about God, and anytime we see celebrities talking about God, it's like, man, if we could just be famous in the world and love God, that's like the win. Sometimes I feel like in the millennial book, and what I'm seeing is we're starting to see that doesn't, there's areas where that just won't work. Chris Pratt eventually gets critiqued for his faith. Everyone gets critiqued for certain areas of their faith. And so what I love about what Luke is talking about is Gen Z is getting a little bit more fervent. While there may be less in the next generation, when it comes to Christians, the strength of their faith, I feel like, is growing stronger than we've seen in casual Christianity. And lastly, the desire for holiness, fasting, for just really finding our identity in the gospel. The things that I think are age-old, timeless principles, I'm starting to see a revival, even the desire for revival, not fame, but revival. I love that devotion that I'm starting to see among Gen Z leaders. But I mean, Luke, if you want to share just a little on that, because you and a couple others have
Sure.
definitely instigated me seeing that contrast.
Yeah, I would say one of the things, Grant, that you just mentioned is just the cause orientedness in Gen Z. I'd say with millennials versus Gen Z, almost these two different identifiers of, you have like almost like the idol of comfort in the millennial generation, and then you have more so the idol of self in the Gen Z generation, where it is very much self-actualization, self-realization, where self is the ultimate. Like, I want to be a part of a cause because I want to be the hero.
Yeah.
And bad side of that. Good side of that is there is, I believe Jesus is preparing the next generation in his church for potential coming persecution. I think there's an undercurrent of a generation that will probably be the first to not be a Christian majority in at least our nation in a long time, moving into a very post-Christian culture. And I think there's something that God in his sovereignty, obviously natural, nature versus nurture, things that have contributed to that. But I also think the Lord in his sovereignty is really put into the DNA of a generation this determination to go, come hell or high water. We know what we're going to stand for, and we're going to press in and go for it no matter what happens. And so I do see that in Gen Z. There's a willingness to suffer for a cause. There's, even in the smallest thing of taking a pay cut, there's a willingness to really just this deep down desire for cause in general. And so I would say that's a little bit of the difference of where Gen Z is very entrepreneurial, where they're not really looking for something to be given to them. With millennials, like, I think the big critique was just always the entitlement mentality, right? Of like, I deserve this, it should be given to me. But with Gen Z, it's very entrepreneurial of, I'm going to go out and get it. Like, if, I'm not waiting for somebody to hand it to me. I'm going to start a business. I'm going to start a ministry. I'm going to start a movement, whatever it is. And so I think those are some of the contrasts that I've been seeing.
That's great. As I'm looking at the landscape of church ministry, I'm wondering, like, how do you guys in your ministries and how you're working with young people, how are you being intentional to disciple the whole life of Gen Z, and what are some tips that you've picked up along the way? Luke, let's start with you on that one.
Yeah. I would say definitely not an expert by this in any means. And so this is also something I'm growing in, but I think for several of the guys that I disciple, I try to just do life with them, whether it's like, hey, let's go work out. Hey, come hang out with my family. Hey, it's not, I try not to just limit it to, let's just go get coffee and go through this specific, resource or discipleship, thing, which is helpful and needed. I think we need reproducible processes to help with discipleship so that they can then go on and disciple. Because I think if the person you're discipling can't disciple somebody else, we haven't made a disciple. But I think that whole life is huge because, they're not just asking questions. They're asking questions about their money. Like, how do I steward my money? What do I do with my job? Where do I go to school? And I think in a very individualistic culture where there used to be much more, for all of human history, it's like you were in a community, right? Like you had the older people in your life that had walked that way before, that could help show you, how to work through family dynamics, what to do with work. Like it was more than just, hey, we set aside this little bit of time to talk about, your Bible reading, but it's that whole part of your life, the questions about money, the questions about, dating and relationships. And so I think as much as possible, allowing them to see my life and do more with them than simply meet for an hour. But honestly, like let's hang out, like let's do something fun in addition, which I think there's are parts of young adult ministry that goes too far in that direction, where they're basically building younger friends and not making disciples. But I think that is a big piece, because one thing that's being brought out a lot with Gen Z is they are really looking for mentors, and they don't know how to go about it. They don't know how to go about getting discipled, and they're afraid to ask. And then on the other side, you have an older generation that really wants to disciple, genuinely wants to disciple, but they want the approval and affirmation. Like they want young people to think they're cool. Like there was a leader that we were with just a couple weeks ago, major leader in the body of Christ, and was like, hey, can I be honest? I want Gen Z to think I'm cool as much as you want me to have my approval. And so I think you have those two flip sides of the coin. But yeah, just doing life with them, letting them see into your life. And it also kind of gets a bit of that like polished facade off of it, of like, oh, this is a real person, and following Christ, and that imitate me as I imitate Christ example of Paul. And so those are a couple of things I would say on that point.
Yeah. I would say for the next generation, Joe, what you pointed out is probably one of my favorite things that's like kind of a silver lining of the next generation is one, you almost have to disciple into them or teach them about the sacred and secular divide. It's like they don't know about it. It's definitely not in their bones, if you will. While before you used to have like faith and work conferences and all these different conferences, like to show that, hey, these can go together. Well, for the next generation, I don't think, luckily they don't know that. It's sacred. I don't know if they know how to tap into the sacred into all these different spaces, but they definitely don't try to divide them as much. I think there could be discipleship, empowerment, and showing, man, there's so much areas here that they could be more sacred and more missional. The second thing is, I think that silver lining of the next generation is they are so passionate about doing something and making a difference that they've graduated the idea of just wanting to show up to church and that be the end of the scorecard. Like to just show up, give, and maybe volunteer, and at best bring some people with you. That's kind of what the hero in the congregation at least has looked like. And I think they like, I want to take everything that's happening here into the world. And that's what I do love about Q, where I work, is them kind of identifying or like working with the language around those 8 channels of business, education, the public square, family, entertainment, that there's these areas that make and shift the culture that you live in. And we have Christians. God has, we have brothers and sisters in all these different channels. And I guess one way I'm actively, similar to Luke, not professional at it, but me and a friend, Noah Heron, I'm trying to help him as he plants a church and help him with like the DNA of the church. And one thing I've said is, bro, for the love of God, literally for the love of God, like we have got to not make church all about like, hey, come and listen to me next week, and come back next week and listen to me, and come back next week and listen to me. I always say Jesus, mentorship is come and meet with me. Jesus said, come and follow me, discipleship. And most of the time we're just saying, come and listen to me next week, and then come and listen to me next week, and come and listen to me next week. And again, luckily the next generation is graduated and tired and ready for something more than just sitting down and listening to someone. And so what we're talking about here is, how do we get back to Ephesians 4:11 in this church, where we actually, if we're a part of the leadership team on the church, the church should not hinge on our success in our leadership. It should hinge on the congregation. William Carey said it shouldn't be the seating capacity, it should be the sending capacity. And so for us, it's like, how do we get back to building up the body and equipping the saints for the work of the ministry? So kind of using those channels and identifying what are the major channels of Nashville here. And I actually think every city, you could kind of identify what are the strong channels of those major cities. And in LA, I think it's entertainment. In New York City, I think it's entertainment. I think there's fashion. I think business is huge. And DC, the channel of politics, is very influential. In Boston, that's a heavy educational city. Some of the most influential cities for those channels. And if Nashville, I think, is entertainment. I think church is a big channel, of course, and maybe business. And then I would like, let's find those channels. And if we get Christians in those areas, how do we start to recruit Christian leaders and sages, if you will, that are there, and kind of give them ambassador and discipling roles to educate and lead groups of people that, hey, I mean, as much as I want to hear sometimes a pastor speak on money or on politics or on family or on every topic, it's great to hear from someone who's killing it in the marketplace to also share a lot on that and the difficulties of what's it like to be in Hollywood and be an entertainer, but also to not compromise and to keep your faith. And anyway, I think what we're trying to do is how to create communities and even tracks for Christians, creatives, and Christian. And here, medical industry is really big. Is like, how do we think about if we're going to have a lot of Christians in the medical space, and we spend 1/3 of our life at work? Then it's not just to gain money to give alone. It's also a space where we have time, sacred time, that we could be excellent at what we do. We could be faithful. We could lead with character. We could create a culture of character and hospitality, and ideally and potentially maybe we could be extremely evangelistic as well, and very steward our resources well. And so I think the church starts hinging success on the success of its people, especially also in their jobs, since we spend so much time and intentionality and we go to school for this. Why would we not tap into discipling them into their ambassador role in the workplace as well?
Yeah, Luke, I mean, so you're listening to Grant. He just shared a great, passionate, description of like a vision, a great, open vision for the church. Like Luke, which as a Gen Zer, what resonated with you about Grant's vision there?
I think getting beyond. So I think one thing in Gen Z, like Grant mentioned, is getting beyond where I think for a long time, the only way that most people saw to be able to serve God was by becoming a pastor or a missionary or maybe a worship leader. But even with the entrepreneurial aspect of Gen Z, they're discovering, maybe more so forgetting, I think, maybe than discovering actually, some of those ideas of like, hey, I've got to be a pastor to serve God. Or I remember one story about this doctor that would show up early for all these conferences to set up chairs. And the pastor's like, man, so glad that you came. And he was like, oh, it's my favorite thing to do because it's the one day a year that I get to do God's work. And it was like, man, he's like, he thinks that what he's doing 364 days out of the year is not God's work. And so I think we're seeing with Gen Z a good piece, potentially. We'll see, there might be downsides to this, but this self-actualization piece, like what have I been made to do? What have I been called to do? Is a realization that you can be called to do something and have a calling from God that's not to be a pastor, not to be a worship leader, not to be a missionary, and that it's important. I think, in my opinion, probably one of the holiest men that we have record of in history is Daniel, and the dude's a politician. You have Nehemiah, you have Joseph, Esther, majority of the people. There's a great book by Timothy Keller called Every Good Endeavor. And one of the things he said in there is, he said, if you thought of a book titled The Man God Uses, he goes, you would immediately think of a pastor or a missionary or something like that. He goes, but what if it was about Joseph? You'd be pretty surprised. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a resonating in Gen Z to go, wow, God has a vast array of callings, and I don't have to suppress what God has made me to do. If it's to be in business, if it's to be in a different sphere. But I think also the flip side is there's also a great desire, I think, to be like culture in Gen Z rather than to be in the world but not of it, and not realizing the difference between being a friend of sinners and a friend of the world. And the Bible makes a very clear distinction between the two. And so, but I think Gen Z and I also resonate with the fact that I think even a lot of young ministry leaders, it's like they've got like side hustles, like they're starting businesses and ministries, and they're doing it all at the same time. And I think there's going to be a greater impact in the kingdom because of it.
Hey, so at Barna, we're all about asking questions, right? So what I want to do is I want to turn it around to you guys. What do you think are the most pressing, important questions that Gen Z are asking of us leaders and of the church? What are the big questions that are on their mind, on their hearts, that they're wanting answers for?
I mean, I'd say right now, I think with what's been going on recently, the question of the problem of evil. I think that's a huge thing for them with the shootings that have been taking place. They're like, how on earth could this happen and there be a God that's involved in everyday life? And how, if he is involved, how could he be good? I think that's a big question that they're asking. I think also questions that they're asking, maybe not so much able to put it into words, but that they're experiencing that's affecting how they view the church, is also the character of major leaders within the church. So much of, that's very public news. I think ever since, honestly, I don't even like to name names, but ever since just certain stories broke, it has become a great soundbite for the media. And so it's getting spread everywhere as soon as it comes out. And so that's a big piece of why there's distrust from Gen Z, I think, of going, Jesus is cool, but the church maybe not so much. So I think that's a big question that they're asking. Those would be the first two off the top of my head. And I think also the question of, how does following Jesus actually relate to my everyday life? How does it relate to the anxiety that I'm experiencing, the depression that I'm experiencing, the pain at home, maybe the abuse that I've experienced? How does this actually come into the midst of what I'm experiencing and transform and heal and be relevant to the everyday life that I'm living? I would say are some of the first that come to mind.
Yeah. Quick ones I'll say is I think a lot of young people, Christian and not Christian, I would even say for a Christian young person, it's almost harder because they feel like God's been silent on this, but they're trying to figure out, what is it that I distinctly was designed to make a difference in the world? I feel like a lot of young Christians, even that have finished college, are in their first or second or third job that often remotely has nothing to do with what they graduated in. And they feel this tension, like this gnawing at their soul, that they're missing out, that they're seeing their friends go and they're getting left behind. And if you're a Christian, you feel like, God, what have you forgotten about me? Or did I mess up? Or just what is it that I'm supposed to go and do? Or how can I get to doing this dream that's in my heart? Two, I do think maybe, again, where they couldn't put into words, but I think many young people are struggling a ton with comparison. It's just the amount of arenas and areas. I mean, keeping up with the Jones used to be like, I saw their front yard, the neighbor's front yard, their new car, maybe their house being renovated. Now, I mean, I could see I'm comparing to people I've never even met before. And I have the ability to compare my lunch to their lunch, my job. I can see into so many facets of people's lives. And just learning a good theology of identity all that I think would be really helpful. I think, big one right now is, even for millennials, I struggled with this a lot, and I think Gen Z even more, it's going to be harder for them, is how do I be faithful as a Christian and also almost automatically get labeled as like a hate group, or as someone who's apparently hating people or judgmental or legalistic. Like to be a Christian today, we're less and less the majority, almost minority, that it's really somewhat of it may be good. It's a sacrifice to say, I'm with these guys. I'm walking with Christ. And then third, I would say, I do think I'm seeing a lot among young Christian women, just more understanding, questions around what does it look like to when it comes to women in the church, and what has historically been maybe sometimes would be viewed as limited roles for them in the church, in the family, and beyond. And then what could it look like, and what is God's view for women today, especially when there's so much more women in the church than there are men.
And this is what I love about the church, right? You guys just brought up some of the pressing questions a lot of Gen Z are asking, and the church has answers for them. The question is, how do we unlock those answers, right? And how do we not get in the way of some of those answers, being answered for young people? And so I'd love to get practical, guys. Like, and we know, those of us who've been in ministry, we know that this can be messy. It can be a little daunting Sometimes, the younger generations can seem like a million miles away. How do we bring them close? How do we understand them better? And then how do we activate them to make a difference, even in the midst of it being a little messy and a little unpredictable? Luke, what's your advice to church leaders who are listening today?
Yeah, I love that question because I think it is a very, I'm hearing that question a lot from church leaders of, we don't have any young people in our church that can lead, or that we would trust to lead, or that we would trust to empower or to delegate to. And I think one of the things I think about in that conversation a ton is, because it is messy, is when Jesus sends out his disciples, and it says he sends them out before his face into all the towns where he was about to go, and sends them all out. They come back. One of these towns has rejected the gospel, and they ask to call down fire from heaven on this town. And, just imagine, like, you send out some teenagers or some young adults to go preach the gospel somewhere, and they come back and they're like, hey, they rejected it. Can we go back and break all their legs? Like, you'd be like, they're asking to kill people. Like, this is not, I think we kind of gloss over that. Like, they're asking for these people to die. And if somebody came back and said that to me and was serious, like they were, I'd be like, you need to cool down and probably never be in ministry again, or at least take like 3 years to chill out. But what I love is that happens in Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 10, Jesus sends out the 70. It's like, you thought that was a good idea after the conversation that you just had. But what I love about the way that Jesus leads, and this is a constant thing that I always try to keep in mind, is expecting they're going to make mistakes, but realizing that that's just part of it. Like, you have to build that into your idea of what it means to raise up and release leaders. I love that Jesus also, he doesn't brush it under the rug or like try to be cute with it. He gives them very clear feedback. But then what he doesn't do in the midst of them making a mistake is take away their authority and influence, which I think can be our tendency, is when somebody messes up, which they're going to, like, you try to empower young leaders, like, somebody's going to say something heretical probably at some point, and you're going to have to correct it. It's just, part of it. But he doesn't take away their influence. He doesn't take away their authority. He corrects, he gives feedback, and then he sends them out again with 58 of their friends. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. And again, this is something for us as leaders. I think a common complaint is, hey, there's no young people that can lead, or, who's the leader I can pass the baton to that's coming up. And I think if there are no leaders within our church, within our organization that are ready to lead, that are ready to have the baton passed to them, that's more of an indictment on us as leaders than it is on the generation. Because that's something I always try to tell myself. If I'm like, man, we have a lack of leaders, we have a leadership pipeline problem, I'm going, okay, that's probably on me, because I'm not identifying that, I'm not raising it up, I'm not giving feedback. And I think it's always true, whether in sports, in business, whatever it is, that you learn the best and the quickest when you're in the game, not on the bench. And, you put somebody in the game to play, they're not going to be good very quick, and they're probably not going to contribute a whole lot early. But after 6 months of that, they're going to be where they would have been after 5 years of sitting on the bench to watch. And so I think as much as getting them into the game and letting them try, realizing they're going to make mistakes, probably not contribute a whole lot at first, require a lot of feedback, but not withdrawing the influence and authority you give them in the midst of that, unless there's major character flaws and persistent character flaws that need to be corrected and readjusted. Got to get them in the game, and you got to let them play, and realize that I think every generation thinks, nobody's trustworthy in the next generation. Nobody's as good as I was at this age. And, that's my tendency already at 25. And I'm like, we got to combat that. So.
Yeah, I'll quickly say that I think what Luke's saying is really, really wise. I would bet that many of the leaders, especially pastors that are listening today, if you look back at your story, you probably had someone who put you in the game a little sooner than you deserve to be in the game. They gave you responsibilities bigger than you deserve. They kind of put their neck on the line and gambled on you. They saw things that maybe you didn't even see, but they gave you an opportunity to fail forward or to like see something in you that again, you didn't know about. And I found some of the best high capacity young Christian leaders and older Christians now as I got to meet them. They have this common story line where someone did that for them. Someone, again, poured into them and pushed them into the deep end. And they just had to learn how to swim. They started asking questions sooner than they probably would have. They started seeking mentorship. They started reading books because they didn't have the answers, started listening to podcasts. They started being active, and especially it created hunger in them because of that push into the deep end. And so I would just say don't fall into the trap that is such a common trap of asking the wrong question. And it's probably one of the biggest questions I get asked all the time is how do we reach the next generation? It's the question of our day, and when it comes to young people. And I would say that question isn't the right question. I don't think we should ask how do we reach the next generation, or how do we do ministry to the next generation? It should be how do we do ministry through the next generation? Like how do we have them join what we're doing, and even them lead at certain times and reaching their own generation. I think anyone would tell you if you want to go reach another country, how do you reach another country? You don't do it just from afar and you create what you think they need. You go and you work with, not even on some leaders, that you work with some leaders there that can translate. These are the needs, these are the hurts, these are the pains. This is why the way you preach the gospel is going to be seen this way. But if we talk about it this way, which is still, it's not compromising, but it's like, this is what they're looking for, and this is where the gospel is so much better than what they're looking for. I'll just say, yeah, don't just do ministry to them, do ministry through them, and all of a sudden you'll see a lot more people there. I think a lot of churches have to ask. So the real question is, do you really want to do ministry through them, or do you just want them to show up? Because that's whenever churches say to me, we want to grow young, I ask them, do you mean you want to change a lot, or do you mean you want a younger audience? Because you got to differentiate between the two, and ask the hard questions like, do you want to change some of the people in your executive team and add some young people? Do you want to change some of the communicators at your conference or at your church and have some younger people, the MCs? Are they going to be younger? Or some of the leadership team, the worship style, the experience, the budget? Are you willing to change all these things because you want young people? And so all I know is I've never seen a church that doesn't sincerely want young people. I would ask the question, how much do you want young people? Because there's no way to truly reach young people without changing things. And that's a good thing, because I would say when you do ministry through them and with them, ministry is better. We have this phrase, better together. I think ministry is better when it's more racially diverse, when it's even denominationally diverse, when it's generationally diverse. And I would even kind of clearly have spoken a lot about like industry, where we bring Christians with different perspectives because they're in different industries than just church pastors and seminary training, but Christians in all these different sectors. God has a big family, and I don't think we struggle with the lack of resources in the church, or struggle with the lack of churches or nonprofits or ideas. I think we struggle with uniting and bringing all these guys in that God's already given us, and being on like, how do we learn from each other and work together? But yeah, again, just not doing ministry to them, but doing ministry through them. And then lastly, just accepting that reaching the next generation is not an easy thing. It's not a silver bullet. You kind of quoted the story of them praying. I've never heard a sermon, Luke, where they talk about that, where the disciples asked for them to destroy a city. And I would just say, in Matthew 17:17, Jesus said in red letters, "Oh, how long will I have to put up with you people?" I've never seen it on a coffee cup or a t-shirt, but Jesus said, "How long will I have to put up with you people, you twisted and perverse generation?" As he's talking about the disciples. And I know it's kind of joking, but I'm serious, as I really saw that and I thought, man, Jesus didn't sin when he said that. But that sounds so mean for him to say, "Oh, how long will I have to put up with you people?" And I don't have kids, but I've talked to enough parents that would say in their heart, at least, maybe even verbally, to their spouse, how they said, "Babe, how long is this season going to last, you think? Like, this is hard. This is difficult." And I think if you're not saying that, you're probably not discipling. You're probably just influencing or speaking to from a distance. But no one disciples someone, or especially parents someone, without having to kind of go through a couple seasons where you're like, man, it's going to take a minute. Like, this is hard work. This is difficult. And I think it's just better to set expectations that we want the silver bullet. Like, how do we make this minor change and reach an entire generation that's really hurt by the church, leaving the church, not seeing God active through the church, and instead accept that, no, it's about as hard as parenting. But like Luke showed and we see in the scriptures, but it's worth it because these disciples became prayer warriors. They took the gospel to nations. They prayed for boldness when they were beaten instead of prayed for a hedge of protection. Like, they're so different because the investment Jesus made, and I think you will make in the next generation.
Yeah, that's a powerful vision, Grant. And Luke, I love how, Grant's vision, I think, actually is living out through your life, right? We can see, when you have a group of leaders that supports a young person like yourself to say, you know what, Luke, we're not gonna just do ministry at you or to you, but we're gonna do ministry through you. And Luke,
Yeah.
we can see some great fruit already happening as a 25-year-old young person. I'd love for you to share a little bit about your ministry, actually.
Yeah.
What are you doing right now, and how can people connect with you online?
Yeah, absolutely. So we launched a ministry called Consecrate in October of last year. And the heart behind that is to call the next generation to total devotion to Jesus and his mission, to call them to consecration. And the way we define consecration is to be set apart from the world and set apart for the mission of Jesus. And so we do that through large scale gatherings that partner with the local church. So we're very purposeful to do everything in, with, by the local church. And it's a catalyzer for the local church where we raise all the funds for the gathering, where all people have to do is bring their young people. The tickets don't cost anything. The church doesn't have to bear the burden of that. We raise all the funds for it. And so we have right now one of those gatherings a year, where those will start to expand, where we have more of them. But this year it's going to be in Nashville in November. And yeah, you can learn more about it on our website or on social media. The website's just consecrate2022.com or consecrate_movement on Instagram. But that's kind of an easy way to keep up with it and learn more.
Sounds awesome, Luke. Hey, and Grant, you're next gen director at Q. What are you doing to actively engage next gen at Q, and what do we need to know about?
Yeah. I mean, these days we're doing strategic gatherings for just high capacity. I'm always looking for young Christians that God is using in special ways in culture. Again, if actors, actresses, speakers, authors, musicians, whether they're American Idol or The Voice, or maybe they're an online influencer. It's a lot of different people. I'm just looking who are Christians in culture. Is if we have a generation that generally isn't going to church once they hit college, then we also need to not just have seminaries that train pastors for the church, but also have organizations like what we want to do is train Christians, and I would say missionaries for culture. And so, we do strategic gatherings, and next year we'll do a gathering called the Next Gen Summit I think in November as well, where we'll gather a lot of these high capacity young Christian leaders, but through Q, we'll also open it up to the Q audience to bring in their young people as well.
Awesome. Well, hey, Grant, Luke, appreciate your time, and thanks for your passion. Thanks for your ministry. Thanks for the powerful vision that you've cast today as you've answered some of our questions. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Well, Joe, Grant, and Luke, thank you so much for those insights. I really, really appreciate it. Hey, if this episode helped you, would you share it on social media? Would you share it with a friend? Text the link to a friend and let us know it made a difference, because we're here committed to helping you lead through this current situation that we're in. It seems like it never gets easier. It just gets more complicated. And that's why we're here. So as always, we would love for you to get the very best from Barna. So you can go to barna.com/access and get a special bonus for our listeners. Use the promo code ChurchPulse and you will get 20% off your Barna Access Plus subscription. That's access to everything that Barna does, all the reports, all the resources. You get 20% off if you go to barna.com/access. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next time on Church Pulse Weekly.